I did not thank you because it is your duty. That phrase fell on me like a bucket of ice water that does not just extinguish, but burns. I repeated it in my head over and over again until I felt that every word scraped on the inside as if it were made of crushed glass. My name is Margaret, and I am 68 years old. I have been many things in my life: an obedient daughter, a loyal wife, a mother who poured her soul into everything, a grandmother who forgets to eat just to give another spoonful to her grandson. But I had never been in debt for the affection that I myself gave. That afternoon in my kitchen, with the floor freshly mopped and the smell of chicken soup still floating in the air, I knew that a part of me had broken forever. There were no screams. There were no slamming doors. There was a thick silence, as if the whole house had run out of air at the same time. I remember my hands trembling over the floral tablecloth, the ceramic mug half washed, and a drop of water running slowly down my wrist, tickling insistent, as if it wanted to wake me up from a nightmare that unfortunately was real. I felt the weight of my years all at once, as if all the early mornings when I got up to prepare lunch boxes, all the times I swallowed my tears so as not to worry anyone had sent me the bill in that instant. It is your duty. What a clean phrase, so sharp, so comfortable for the one who drops it, and so cruel for the one who receives it. I stood looking at the window where the afternoon sun stretched over the small patio. The light caressed the pots of bougainvilleas that I planted when I became a widow. That improvised garden that helped me fill the holes where the memory of my husband still echoed. The steam from the soup fogged up the glass a little, and for a second I saw myself reflected with an opaque halo around me, as if my own life were blurred. I thought of my mother, of her rough and loving hands, of how she never told me that I had to love her. She earned it by taking care of me, looking at me as if I were always enough. I looked at my reflection, my gray hair tied back with a worn-out clip, my skin marked by the years, the eyes that had seen too many goodbyes, and I wondered when I ceased to exist as a person to become a function. The most painful thing was not the phrase itself, but what it revealed, that behind it there was a silent accounting in which I appeared as a fixed expense, as a thing that is expected, and that is it. I who so many times changed plans to adjust to those of others, who learned to bite my tongue so as not to cause conflicts. I who believed that was the language of mature love, yielding understanding, sustaining. When did love become a to-do list? When did being a mother become justifying everything? I gripped the kitchen counter with numb fingers. I felt a wave of heat climb up my chest, and without tears, yet a kind of emptiness behind my sternum, a hole that I did not know how to fill. I do not want to lie to myself, there was also wounded pride. At my age, one gets used to living with less noise, more order, small routines that give meaning. Watering the plants at dawn, changing the sheets on Saturdays, playing music while chopping onions for the stew. And yet, all my inner order decomposed with that phrase. Something in me wanted to scream my duty. Since when is saying thank you a luxury? But other things kept me quiet. The dignity I learned through hard knocks, and the certainty that the truth, when it arrives without flowers, still blooms in the roughest place. I took 2 steps toward the sink, turned on the faucet so the water would run, and while the sound filled the kitchen, I started telling stories inside my head. A habit of mine, I tell myself stories so as not to fall. I told myself that this could not be the last thing I heard about myself. I repeated to myself that no, the years had not made me invisible by a whim of time, but by a chain of small resignations that I had disguised as love, and I understood that it was not just my son's words. They were the echo of many other unsaid phrases, of many glances loaded with haste, of many favors asked, as if they were the exact time on a clock. It is just time, and that is it. I held on to the edge of the marble and let the tiredness weigh on me, an ancient tiredness deep in the bone. The The body keeps memory, and mine remembered the girl I was sitting on the patio, with my grandma listening to her say, "Affection is not begged for, darling. Affection is honored." In that saying, I rediscovered a tool. Not to fight, I no longer have the desire to fight with anyone, but to set a boundary that does not sound like punishment, but like self-love. I thought of my grandson, of his laughter with baby teeth, of the softness of his hair. I thought of my husband, of the way he said goodbye with a quick kiss before going to work. And I thought of me, of the woman who still lives inside, who hurts, who takes a deep breath so as not to let herself fall, who promises herself something, and this time wants to keep it. I did not cry in that moment. The tears came later, slowly, like rain learning to fall again. I sat at the table with my apron on and looked at my hands. There are maps on my knuckles, fine rivers of veins that go up and down the whole history, written in lines that I no longer need to read to know what they say. I touched the wood with my fingers and thanked in silence for the small courage I thought I had lost. I decided that this phrase would not be the final period, but the uncomfortable beginning of a different chapter, because something inside me woke up with a cold clarity. If the gesture of caring becomes an obligation, it is not love that is missing, it is respect. And without respect, there is no house that lasts. That afternoon, when the sun began to go down and the air smelled of freshly baked bread in the neighborhood, I took a deep breath and knew that I had to look back with honesty. Not to punish myself, but to understand where I stopped listening to myself. I wanted to remember the folds of the days, the small symptoms of a life that was narrowing without me noticing. I wanted to know when the woman who dreamed of simple trips to the ocean decided that her place was always in the back row holding everyone else's coats. Perhaps there, among the small things, I would find the root of this pain. I did not have answers yet, just an intuition that burned sweet and firm inside me. The truth hides in the everyday and the mystery of my sadness as well. It is not a mystery from a novel, it is the intimate mystery of houses. Where are things kept that are no longer used? In what drawer do kisses get lost? Who turns off the light without asking if someone is still reading? I wiped my face with the back of my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I did not want to finish washing the mug. I turned off the stove, opened the door to the patio, and let the afternoon air come in. Because although it hurts to pronounce it, "I did not thank you because it is your duty," was more than a phrase, it was a key that opened a closed room in my memory. And I have the feeling no. The certainty that what I am going to find there is going to change my life. I do not know yet how or how much, but I sense that the thread I am going to pull starts with an old and urgent question. At what moment did I stop belonging to myself? During years, my life revolved around others. My house was not just my refuge, it was the meeting point where everyone landed when something broke in their lives. It was I who put the pot of beans on the fire and the folded napkins on the table, who listened without looking at the clock, who said, "Don't worry," while my heart became small inside. When I became a widow, instead of secluding myself, I opened the doors even wider. It seemed to me that if the house was full of noise, loneliness would not catch up to me. And so I did it. Grandkids, neighbors, friends of my children, everyone found a free armchair and a hot coffee in my living room. I thought that in that way, I would be necessary. In the mornings, the routine was my life jacket. I woke up before dawn, put the water on to heat for tea, watered the plants on the patio, and swept the entrance even if there were no leaves. Order was my way of keeping my mind quiet. I liked feeling the aroma of toast while the radio murmured news in a low voice. Sometimes when the light came in soft through the window, I stopped for a few seconds to look at the framed photos. The day of my oldest son's wedding, my granddaughter's first communion, a family portrait, where we all smiled as if happiness were eternal. Those images were my fuel to keep going, to believe that the sacrifice was worth it. I remember when my son moved in with his wife, I helped him pack every box, to label the spice jars with care, to fold the clothes so they would not wrinkle. I cried in silence when he closed the door of his room for the last time, but I also felt proud. I had fulfilled my role as a mother, and although now they lived in their own home, I was still looking out for them. Have you eaten yet? Do you need me to watch the kids? Should I wash your clothes? Even on rainy days, I went out with an umbrella and boots to bring them soup if someone was sick. No one asked me for it, I simply did it because that is how I understood love, caring, without expecting anything in return. I did not realize that anything in return was starting to leave me empty. Sometimes at the end of the day, I found myself talking alone in the kitchen while I put away the clean dishes. I told myself, today they didn't call to see how I am either. And then I scolded myself in silence. Don't be dramatic, Margaret. Young people have their own lives. But deep down it hurt. It hurt that the calls were only to ask me for something, that the visits coincided with a pending favor, that my birthdays passed almost unnoticed, except for a cake bought in a rush. My life was like a river that kept flowing, but not for me, but to support everyone else's boats. And I did it without protesting. Sundays were the days of the most movement. I prepared food for 10 people, even though sometimes only 4 came. There was always extra just in case someone arrived unexpectedly. That habit was left to me by my grandmother. Better to have leftovers than to run out, she used to say, and so I got used to having leftover food but running out of time for myself. There were days when I dreamed of traveling, of visiting the ocean again. It has been more than 20 years since I smelled the salty breeze or felt the sand between my toes. But every time I thought about it, something happened. A school project to help with someone's illness, a debt to cover. My savings went to medicine, supplies, repairs, for the house that was no longer just mine but everyone's. And I convinced myself there will be time later. But later never arrived. There was in me a mixture of pride and exhaustion. Pride because my family was standing, largely thanks to me. Exhaustion because it seemed that no one saw it. And yet I kept smiling in the photos, serving coffee to whoever arrived, saying phrases like, "I am here for whatever you need," although inside I wanted to say, I also need someone to be here for me. Over the years, I started to feel that my life was like an old wooden chair, firm, reliable, but full of scratches that no one repairs because it continues to fulfill its function. I wondered if anyone would ever stop to polish it, to be thankful that it was there, supporting everyone's weight. But I kept quiet because I thought that was how it should be, because that is how I was raised. The mother is the center, and the center does not move. That portrait of my life before the blow was what made my son's words go through me with such force. It was not just the phrase of any given day. It was the confirmation that for them, my devotion had become so natural that it no longer deserved even a thank you. And it was in that instant when I felt that something had to change, that the story I was writing about myself could not end like this. The day my son called me to take care of his dog, I was sitting on the patio, pulling apart chamomile flowers to make tea. It was a mild afternoon with the song of sparrows slipping through the bougainvilleas. "Mom, can you take care of Max for a few days? We have a work trip and I don't want to leave him at a kennel," he told me with a rushed voice. I did not even hesitate. "Sure, bring him whenever you want." I felt in my chest a mixture of pride and tenderness. For me, it was an honor that he trusted me with something as important as his pet. It was not just a dog, it was part of his family, and in some way that gesture made me feel that I was still indispensable. Max arrived that same night with his bed, his steel bowl, his kibble, and a handwritten list with feeding times, walks, and even what words he liked to hear. I smiled as I read it. My son was more meticulous than I remembered. I leaned down to pet the animal that wagged its tail and licked my hand. "Are you going to be okay, Max?" I said to him in a low voice. From that moment, I adopted him as if he were mine. I prepared a special corner in the living room near the window so he could see the garden. The next day, early, I took him to walk through the park, and for an instant I felt young again, like when I took my children by the hand to school. At first, it was unexpected company. Max followed me all over the house. He lay at my feet when I sat down to sew, and looked at me with those round eyes that seemed to understand everything. But soon, I discovered that taking care of him was not so simple. The special kibble ran out fast, and I had to go look for it at a store across town because it could not be found at the local grocery store. The dog had a skin allergy and had to be given medicine at certain hours. Some nights he barked without reason, and I got up in my robe to calm him down so the neighbors would not complain. I did all of that without complaining, as if it were an extension of my role as a mother, as if in some way caring for Max gave me back a little piece of the family that no longer lived under my roof. Days passed, and then weeks. The trip of a few days turned into something longer. Quick calls from my son informed me that they were not returning yet, that the work project had been extended. I nodded and said, "Don't worry, everything is fine here." But inside, I was starting to feel the weight. There was a day when I had to cancel a doctor's appointment because Max was sick, and I could not leave him alone. Another day, I did not go to the neighborhood gathering because he had an appointment with the vet. My friends started joking, saying that I had a new baby, and although I smiled inside, I felt a knot in my throat. It had been a long time since anyone depended on me so closely, and now that someone did, there was no one to ask me if I also needed help. I remember a particularly difficult night. Max had a fever, did not want to eat, and spent hours whimpering. I carried him in my arms as if he were a child. I tucked him in with a warm blanket and prayed for him to hold on until the next day to be able to take him to the vet. My arms hurt. My back hurt. But above all, the certainty that no one knew what was happening hurt me. That in the house on the other side of the city, my son and his wife were probably eating dinner calmly, without imagining that I was staying up with the dog with my eyes full of tears. However, I did not stop fulfilling every instruction on the list. I held on to that commitment like someone holding onto a rope so as not to fall. Deep down, I thought that when they returned, they would feel grateful that they would hug me and tell me that I was irreplaceable. I imagined the scene: my grandson smiling my son with a thank you on his lips, my daughter-in-law handing me a small gift as a sign of gratitude. That illusion was what kept me standing. I did not realize that I was placing expectations on something that for them was perhaps routine, something that for me was sacrifice, and for them simply logistics. Every morning while I served the kibble in the bowl, I looked at myself in the reflection of the microwave and told myself, "This is love, Margaret, don't do it expecting anything." And although I repeated it, there was a corner of my heart that yearned for recognition, yearned to hear that my effort had value. What I did not know was that when that day arrived, it would not be a hug that I would receive, but a phrase that would split in two, the woman I had been until then. The weeks turned into a silent test of endurance. At first it seemed like an adventure, but soon the tiredness seeped into my bones like humidity that is not seen, but is felt. Each day was a repeated choreography, getting up before sunrise, heating water for my tea, and immediately attending to Max, who had already learned to wake me up with his little paws against the door. I took him for a walk, even if it rained, even if my knee protested with a stabbing pain that forced me to put my weight on the other foot. I returned home with my pants splashed with mud, turned on the stove to prepare his special food, and only then sat down to eat breakfast. It was no longer my schedule. It was only he who ruled. I remember there were days when I barely spoke to anyone. Only the voice of the announcer on the radio and the sound of Max's little paws down the hallway filled the silence. If I was late giving him the medicine, I felt guilty, as if I had failed at something sacred. I discovered myself more than once praying for him not to get sick, for nothing to happen to me either, because if I was missing, who would take care of him? That feeling of being essential, which at first filled me with purpose, started to become a burden. The responsibility was so big that even my own plans became secondary. One afternoon, I canceled my visit to the neighborhood fair, something I had waited for all month because Max was restless and I was afraid to leave him alone. My neighbors called to tell me that my presence was missed, that it was not the same without me. I answered them with a forced laugh. "Next time, girls." When I hung up the phone, the silence of the house was so dense that I felt like crying. I realized that I was isolating myself, but at the same time, I felt that I could not fail. I had assumed that task like a vow, an invisible promise. The fatigue became evident in small oversights. I forgot my own blood pressure pills. I ate anything in a rush, so as not to interrupt the dog's routine. There were nights when I finally sat in the rocking chair, I fell asleep with my glasses on and the book open on my lap. Sometimes I dreamed that someone walked through the door and said to me, "I'm here, rest." But I woke up, and the only thing I heard was Max's slow breathing beside me. He was my only company, and although he gave me affection, he could not say thank you. There was a moment I will never forget. One early morning, Max started barking desperately, as if he saw something in the dark. I went out to the patio with my robe on the cold cutting my face, and I found him trembling next to the gate. I hugged him and brought him inside, covered him with a blanket, and sat on the floor until he calmed down. There, with my back leaning against the cold wall, I thought about how ironic everything was. I had spent my life taking care of others, and nevertheless, I felt lonelier than ever. Loneliness was an animal that sat beside me every night. I started to notice signs of wear and tear on my own body, deep circles under my eyes, hands cracked from washing so many dishes, a hunched back. And nevertheless, something in me kept working on automatic. I told myself that the sacrifice was temporary, that soon my son would return and see everything I had done. I imagined the scene like a movie, them walking through the door surprised by how well cared for Max was thanking me with a long hug. That fantasy was what kept me standing, the engine that pushed me to continue despite the pain. But with every day that passed, a shadow of tiredness installed itself in my spirit. I started to feel a small pang of resentment, not toward the dog, but toward the situation. I wondered if my son knew the effort that all this implied, if he ever stopped to think that I also had my life, my pains, my limits. I answered myself that surely not, that they trusted that I could handle everything like always. And there I understood something that left a bitter taste. My strength, the one I built with so much pride, was also my prison, because as long as I could handle everything, no one would see that I needed help. Every night before going to bed, I promised myself that I was going to talk to my son when he returned, that I would tell him how I felt, that I needed them to value my time. But when I thought about his reaction, about the possibility that he would get upset, I swallowed hard and kept quiet. After all, I told myself, it is just a few more days. But deep down, something inside me was starting to crack. It was as if a very ancient voice whispered to me, "This is not just tiredness, Margaret. It is something deeper. It is the bill for all the silences you have kept." The day my son finally returned, I had spent the morning cleaning the house, washing Max's bed, preparing a stew that smelled of home. I wanted everything to be perfect. I looked at myself in the mirror before they arrived, and I tied back my hair with care, as if it were a special visit. When I heard the sound of the gate opening, my heart skipped a beat. Max ran to meet him, wagging his tail, and I smiled, feeling that the sacrifice had been worth it. I prepared to receive them with joy, and in my mind to hear that thank you that I had waited for during weeks. But instead of gratitude, what I received was a phrase that cut my legs out from under me. "I did not thank you, because it is your duty." Why, there was no hug. There was no look of complicity, only those words said with naturalness, like someone discussing the weather. I heard them echoing in my head, while my smile froze on my face. I remained motionless with the wooden spoon in my hand, as if time had stopped. It was as if someone had thrown a delicate vase to the ground and left it in pieces without even bending down to pick them up. I felt the blood drain to my feet. The kitchen became too small, the smell of the stew too dense. I had to lean on the countertop so as not to lose my balance. It is your duty. Duty did. Being a mother condemned me to be a servant for life. At what moment did my devotion stop being love to become an obligation in the minds of others? I bit my lip so as not to say anything, so as not to unleash an argument right there. But inside, something creaked with a dry sound, like an old branch breaking. I did not answer. I finished serving the food in silence with trembling hands. I sat at the table and watched them while they conversed animatedly among themselves, as if nothing had happened. I felt invisible, as if the chair I was sitting in were empty, and suddenly the house, which had always been my refuge, seemed like a foreign place to me. Every picture on the wall, every tablecloth embroidered by my hands, seemed to ask me in silence, "Who did you do it for all this time?" And I did not know how to answer. After eating, my son stood up, gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, and said goodbye in a hurry. I walked him to the door like always, but this time I did not watch him leave. I closed it before the car started and stayed leaning against the door, feeling that something very deep had detached inside me. It was not just words, it was the denied recognition, it was the clear message that my sacrifice had been assumed as an obligation. That kiss on the cheek could not erase the wound that had just opened. When the silence returned to fill the house, I let myself fall into the rocking chair and looked at Max, who watched me with calm eyes. I petted his head and the tears started to slide down my cheeks slowly without noise. They were not tears of anger, but of a pain that I did not know how to name. The pain of feeling used, of realizing that the love one gives can be so daily for others that it ceases to be seen. I hugged my chest with both hands and promised myself that something had to change, that I could not continue allowing my life to revolve only around the needs of others. That night I could not sleep. I stayed listening to the tick-tock of the clock on the wall, the creaking of the wood, the distant noises of the street. Every sound reminded me that I was alone, that no one would come to ask me how I felt. And in that silence I understood that what hurt me the most was not the phrase my son used, but the certainty that I myself had contributed to that dynamic. I had said yes so many times I had silenced my own desires, that now my voice was no longer heard, not even in my own house. I closed my eyes and remembered my mother telling me when I was a child, "Sarah, a woman can be generous, but she must never forget herself." That phrase hit me as if I were hearing it for the first time. I understood that the moment had arrived to look at myself in the mirror without fear, to ask myself what I wanted for the rest of my life. And that question, although it gave me vertigo, was the spark that ignited something inside me. Something was about to wake up something that had been asleep for too long. The days that followed were the quietest I can remember. It was not the friendly silence of mornings with the radio on, but a heavy silence that seemed to fill everything with dust. I walked through the house and felt that the walls were watching me. Every object seemed to have a history that claimed me. The photograph of my son's wedding in the living room, the tablecloth I embroidered with my own hands, the rocking chair where my husband used to sit and read. Everything spoke to me, but I found no voice to respond. I was turning into a shadow of myself, doing the housework on autopilot, eating out of obligation, sleeping out of exhaustion rather than desire. There were entire afternoons where I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee between my hands, staring into the void. The phrase, "It is your duty," returned to me again and again like an echo that refuses to disappear. I tried to justify my son. He is stressed about work. He did not say it with bad intentions. Maybe he did not realize it. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that it was not just that phrase that hurt. It was everything it represented. Years of assumed favors, of infinite availability, of putting myself in last place. The nights were the worst. I would go to bed, and instead of sleeping, I reviewed scenes from the past. The day I sold my jewelry to help him open his first business, the times I stayed watching the grandchildren so they could go on a trip, the birthdays, where I prepared food for everyone even though I myself did not feel like celebrating. Every memory was like a stone accumulating in my chest. There were not enough tears to drain that weight. One day, I found a box in a drawer with old letters from my husband. In one of them, he told me, "Never forget that you are the heart of this house, but you also deserve to beat for yourself." That sentence disarmed me. I realized that I had built my identity around being the support for others, but I had forgotten to support myself. I asked myself, when was the last time I did something just because it gave me joy without thinking about its utility for others? I did not know how to answer. The guilt also appeared disguised as questions. Could it be that I am selfish for feeling this way? Is it not normal for a mother to always help? Am I exaggerating? But beneath the guilt was a deep sadness, a mourning for the woman I had been. It was like watching in slow motion how a figure was erased from the family photograph. I was there, but I was no longer seen, and that invisibility was consuming me. I started avoiding calls. When the phone rang, I let it ring until it stopped. I did not have the strength to listen to another request, another demand disguised as a greeting. In those days, Max became my only confidant. I would sit beside him and speak to him in a low voice. "Do you know what it is to feel invisible, buddy?" He looked at me with those gentle and calm eyes as if he understood. His company saved me from drowning in my own silence. On Sunday, when my house would normally be full of laughter and footsteps, it was empty. I decided not to cook, not to prepare anything special. I sat on the patio with a notebook and began to write. At first, they were just loose sentences. I am tired. I need to be seen. I want to recover my voice. Little by little, those words turned into a map of what I had stopped doing for myself. There, in the middle of that painful silence, I discovered that sadness could be a teacher if I dared to listen to it. Something resembling determination began to form inside me. It was not yet anger, not even a decision, but it was a new clarity. I could not keep living like this. I had to find the moment to speak, to set a boundary, to remind them that I was not an extension of their needs. That idea scared me, because I feared losing him if I made myself heard, but at the same time it gave me hope, because for the first time in a long time I thought of myself as someone who still had the right to choose. That night, while I turned off the lights in the house, I stopped in the hallway and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were swollen, my face tired, but there was a different shine, a shine I had not seen for years, as if behind the pain a woman was peeking out who had not given up entirely. And there, in that reflection, I felt the first breath of something that would soon turn into strength. Several days passed until someone else's voice pulled me out of my own confinement. It was Teresa, my neighbor of a lifetime, the same one who has seen me in my best and worst moments. She knocked on the door one afternoon when I had just finished sweeping the patio. She carried a plate of pastries in her hand, as if she knew I needed something warm to accompany the silence. She looked at me with those eyes that cannot be fooled and said, "I have not seen you smile for days, Sarah. What is wrong?" I wanted to answer with evasions, but the words got stuck in my throat. We ended up sitting at the kitchen table, the steaming coffee between us. I told her the story of Max, of the weeks of sleeplessness, of the sacrifice that accumulated day after day. And finally, I told her the phrase that had gone through me like a knife. "I didn't even thank you because it is your duty." I said it in a low voice, as if saying it out loud would open the wound again. Teresa sighed, lowered her gaze, and then dropped something on me that I did not expect. "You know Sarah," she said carefully. "It is not the first time I have heard him talk like that. The other day he commented to a neighbor that he was calm because he knew that you had nothing better to do, that for you, taking care of Max was almost a hobby. His words hit me like a slap in the face. I felt heat rising up my face, a mixture of shame and contained rage. It was not just the phrase from that day. It was the confirmation that for him, my time was worth so little that he could dispose of it without even wondering if I had plans, dreams, or needs. I remained silent for a long while. Teresa touched my hand and said, "You are not his shadow, Sarah. You have been a mother, a wife, a friend, but you are also a woman, and you deserve to be seen as something more than an available service." That sentence ignited something in me. It was not the first time someone told me to think of myself, but it was the first time I felt that those words had urgency. It was as if suddenly I saw my life from the outside. Me running after everyone's needs, never stopping to ask if anyone was running after mine. After Teresa left, I remained seated at the table, looking at the pastry I had not even tasted. The rage transformed into a deeper sadness, the kind that makes one breathe deep so as not to break. But in the middle of that sadness, there was also a spark of clarity. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I had to do something different, that I could not continue being the woman who waits in silence to be recognized. If they were not going to see my value, I would have to start seeing it myself. That afternoon, I opened the closet where I keep the boxes of memories and took out an album of old photos. There I was, at 20 years old with a flowered dress, smiling in front of the ocean. There was my young husband with that sure gaze that always made me feel protected. I turned the pages slowly like someone reviewing the footprints of their own life, and in every photo I saw a woman who had been erasing herself little by little, giving up space until she almost disappeared. I promised myself that this woman had to return, that even though I was no longer 20 years old, there was still time to rescue her. That night, I slept little, but for the first time in weeks, I did not cry. I stayed awake thinking about what Teresa had told me about the lightness with which my son had spoken of me, and I felt something new. It was not hate. It was not resentment. It was a serene determination that this would be the last time someone decided for me without asking me. It was time to raise my voice even if it trembled while doing so. It was time to start walking in the direction of myself even if the first steps hurt. That morning I woke up before dawn. The house was in absolute silence, but it was not the silence that weighed on me days ago, but a different one, expectant, as if the air was waiting for something to happen. I got up slowly, went to the patio, and stood watching how the sky went from dark blue to a soft pink tone. It had been a long time since I saw a sunrise like that. I took a breath of cold air, and I felt something move inside me like a door opening slowly after being closed for a long time. I went into the house, and instead of turning on the radio, I sat at the kitchen table with paper and a pencil. I began to write without thinking too much. I want to feel alive again. The sentence came out almost by itself, as if someone else had dictated it. Then came others. I want to stop asking for permission to exist. I want my voice to have weight again. Every word was like a brick I was placing to rebuild myself. It was the first time in years that I asked myself what I wanted, not what the others needed. I opened the old trunk where I keep letters, diaries, and keepsakes. There were the notes my husband left me when he traveled for work. Do not stop going to the movies with your friends. Buy yourself that red dress you like. Promise me you are going to keep dancing even if I am not there. I read each one with tears in my eyes. I realized that he had always wanted me to be something more than the woman who took care of everyone, and yet I had turned sacrifice into my identity, not because someone ordered me to, but because at some moment I confused love with total renunciation. I decided to do something symbolic. I went to the mirror in the hallway, the one I barely looked at from the corner of my eye, and I observed myself carefully. I saw the gray hairs, the wrinkles, the spots on my skin, but I also saw the woman who had survived losses, who had raised children, who had worked until exhaustion, and was still standing. and I spoke to her in a low voice. "You deserve something more, Sarah. You deserve to be heard." I felt a lump in my throat, but also a small flame of pride lighting up inside. That same day, I took out the clothes that did not fit me anymore, or that I had never liked, and put them in a bag to donate. It was a small gesture, but for me, it meant new space room for something different. I prepared my favorite breakfast toast with butter and fresh coffee, and I enjoyed it slowly like a ritual. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel guilt for occupying that time just for me. Later, I wrote a list of things that gave me joy. Walking through the park, taking embroidery classes, visiting my sister in the rural area, or watching old movies with my friends. It was a simple list, but it was mine. And while I wrote it, I felt how the sadness that had kept me immobile began to transform into impulse. It was as if my own body was telling me enough of waiting. It is time to move. That night before sleeping, I lit a candle, and I stayed watching it burn. I thought about the phrase that had hurt me so much, and I understood that I could not undo it, that it had already been said. But I could decide that it would not be the last word about me. I smiled a small but sincere smile, and I promised myself that starting that day, I was going to start choosing with more care how to spend my time, my energy, and my love. I did not know exactly how I was going to do it, but that uncertainty no longer scared me. It was a sensation similar to the one I felt the first time I taught my son to walk. Fear that he would fall, but also the excitement of seeing him take his first step. Now it was I who was learning to walk again, and although my knees trembled, I was willing to continue. That early morning, I slept with a slightly lighter heart, and in my dreams, instead of feeling invisible, I saw myself standing in an open field with the wind on my face, advancing slowly but firmly. It was the clearest image I had had in weeks, me moving toward something I did not yet know, but that I knew was mine. The following days were different. There was no big announcement or dramatic confrontation. My change started in silence, almost like a secret between my heart and me. I got up at the same time as always, but instead of running to attend to the needs of others, I took a moment to sit on the patio, feel the fresh air, and give thanks for the day that was beginning. That small ritual became my reminder that I also existed, that my life was not just an appendix of my family's. One morning, when my son called me to ask if I could go to his house to help with some repairs, I breathed deep before answering. For the first time in a long time, I said, "I can't. I have other plans." I hung up the phone with my heart racing as if I had committed a prank, but the sensation that came after was not guilt, but freedom. That day, I had decided to dedicate to myself. I went to the market, bought flowers for the house, and a book I had been wanting to read for some time. I spent the afternoon in the rocking chair with soft music in the background, and I found myself smiling for no apparent reason. Small gestures began to transform my routine. I went out to walk through the park without waiting for someone to accompany me. I signed up for an embroidery workshop at the community center where I met other women my age who had also gone through stories of silent sacrifices. In those conversations, I found mirrors of my own life and realized I was not alone, that there were many Sarahs learning to recover their voice. The house also began to change. I stopped cooking for crowds every Sunday and started preparing only what I wanted to eat. I stopped having the doors always open, being available at any moment, and although at first there were calls of surprise, "Mom, are you okay?" they soon understood that something in me had changed. My son even asked me one day, "What do you do on Thursdays that you are never home?" And I answered calmly, "I have my activities." It was strange to see a look of confusion on his face, but also of respect. It was not a process free of doubts. There were nights when I asked myself if I was being selfish, if my family would think that I didn't love them the same anymore. But then I would look at myself in the mirror and remember that loving myself was also part of loving them. because if I kept extinguishing myself, there would be nothing left to give them. This understanding became my compass. Every decision I made had to return a little piece of my life to me. One afternoon, while organizing the closet, I found a dress I hadn't worn in years, an emerald green one that my husband adored. I tried it on in front of the mirror and felt something I had forgotten, the simple pleasure of dressing up for myself. That same night, I went to dinner with Teresa and other neighbors. We laughed, shared stories, and I was surprised to discover that I could talk about my pains without feeling shame. It was as if the weight I had carried for so long was coming undone piece by piece. I did not tell my son all these changes, not to hide it, but because I felt I did not need to explain it. It was my process, my return to me. And the more I advanced, the clearer I was that when the next request arrived, or the next situation that placed me in the background, I was going to respond differently. Not with rage, not with reproaches, but with the quiet firmness of someone who knows what she is worth. That certainty became my silent plan, to recover my life without making a scene, without seeking revenge, just rebuilding a space for myself every day. It was my form of peaceful rebellion, my way of teaching the world and myself that I also deserved time, care, and respect. The moment I had imagined so many times arrived without me looking for it. It was a Saturday morning when my son called, his voice with that urgent tone I knew so well. "Mom, can you stay with the kids this weekend? We have an important commitment." The old Sarah would have said yes without thinking, would have run to prepare the house and the grandchildren's favorite food, but the woman who inhabited me now breathed deep before answering. "I'm sorry, son," I said with a serene voice. "This weekend I have other plans." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, as if my answer did not fit his idea of me. "Plans." "What plans?" he asked finally, almost incredulous. I smiled, not out of mockery, but out of certainty, and answered, "Plans with myself. I am going out of town to visit your Aunt Annie and spend a few days with her." My son took a few seconds to react, then just said, "I understand, enjoy it." I hung up the phone with my hands trembling, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline of having set the first clear boundary of my life. That weekend was different from all the others. I took the bus, watched the landscape pass by the window, and felt light. At my sister's house, we laughed, cooked together, talked until dawn. I felt seen, heard part of something, without having to carry everything. I returned home with a renewed heart and the certainty that something had changed definitively. When I returned, my son came to visit me. He observed me with an expression I could not decipher at first. There was something of curiosity, something of discomfort, and also a respect I had never seen in his eyes. "Mom, you seem different," he told me. I answered without hesitation. I decided to take care of myself too. There was no argument, it was not necessary. His shoulders relaxed, and he hugged me, a hug longer than usual, one that seemed to say without words, "I see you." There were no reproaches, there were no past scores to settle. That was my revenge, that my son learned to look at me again, that he understood that I was not an inexhaustible resource, but a woman with a life of her own. The victory was silent but powerful, not because I had made him feel guilty, but because I had claimed my space without shouting. That day I knew that my relationship with him was entering a new stage, one where my voice would have a place at the table. That night, while I sat on the patio with a cup of tea, I felt a peace that had not visited me for years. I looked at the rose bushes blooming and thought that I was also blooming in my own way, in my own time. I remembered the phrase that had hurt me so much and understood that, although I could not erase it, it no longer defined me. What defined me now was this serenity, this sensation of having found myself again. And there, in the middle of the silence of the night, I told myself in a low voice, forgiving is not forgetting what happened. It is deciding that it is not going to keep hurting. I closed my eyes and smiled. Finally, I understood that my power was not in making others feel bad, but in living in a way that made me feel good. The revenge was not shouting or getting even. It was recovering my dignity in silence and showing them with facts that a mother also has the right to be the owner of her time and her joy. The last Sunday of that month, I decided to do something I had never done, go out for a walk, aimlessly at sunrise. The city was calm, the streets barely waking up, and I felt that I was being born together with the day. I was wearing a light dress and a scarf in my hair like when I was young. I walked to the park, sat on a bench, and breathed deep. The fresh air filled my lungs, and I felt alive in a way I had forgotten. While I watched the first people walking with their dogs, I thought of Max. I remembered the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the pain, but also the silent company he gave me in the darkest moments. I smiled. I did not hold a grudge against him, quite the opposite. Thanks to him, I discovered how deep my void was, and I had to fill it with something that was not just sacrifice. He was like a mirror that forced me to look at myself head on. I returned home with a light step without the rush from before. I prepared a breakfast just for me, fresh coffee toast, fruit cut with care. I played music from my youth, and the house filled with a different sound, a sound that spoke of me, not of my obligations. Every corner seemed new, and for the first time in a long time the silence did not weigh on me. It was a kind silence that embraced me. That day my son came to visit me without warning. He entered and found me arranging my plants, humming a song. He looked at me in silence and said, "Mom, I like seeing you like this." There were no long apologies, they were not needed. His sentence was brief but sufficient, and I received it like someone receiving a blessing. I offered him coffee and we sat down to talk, not like mother and son in debt, but like two adults who recognize each other mutually. When he left, I stayed watching the door close, but no longer with a heavy heart, but with gratitude. I had closed a cycle. I realized that I did not need anyone to give me permission to exist, nor thanks to feel valuable. The validation I had sought all my life was now inside me. I looked at the sky where the sunset was beginning to turn orange, and I felt that my story was no longer a story of silent sacrifice, but of redemption. I learned that forgiveness is not a gift given to the other, but an act of self-liberation, and that true power is not in shouting to be heard, but in speaking when it is necessary, and in keeping quiet when that silence is a choice, not an imposition. Today I know that life always offers second chances for those who dare to take them, that it is never too late to recover your voice, to rewrite the ending of our story, and that love, real love, starts with oneself, because no one can give you dignity if you do not decide first to treat yourself with respect. I breathed deep, smiled, and told myself I am more than someone's duty. I am the owner of my days. And with that certainty, I got up, closed the door, and let the night fall softly, not as an ending, but as the beginning of the life I had been waiting to live.